Toronto Star. I'm Raju Mudhar, and this matters.
And I want to congratulate Dana White and the UFC. We love it. We think it's important. Get the sports leagues back. Let's play. But we need sports. We want our sports back.
Let the games reopen. It has been just over 2 months since the major North American sports leagues shut down. In a normal world, the NHL and NBA playoffs would be in full swing. Instead, we are at a place where sports are carefully trying to figure out how to get the actual games back up and running. The big question is, how far are sports leagues willing to go to reopen? The UFC held its first fight card this past weekend, where a fighter and 2 of his cornermen tested positive for the virus, and they were pulled, but the event went on, even though the virus created an awkward handshake between Joe Rogan and fighter Justin Gaethje.
Congratulations. Really amazing. I don't care. Congratulations.
All right, Corona's way worse, so blood won't kill you.
According to reports, this week, Major League Baseball's owners approved a tentative deal to get back going in July.
Baseball is as American as apple pie. Seems only fitting owners want to restart the league on the weekend of July 4th.
Which still has a lot to work out, like getting approval from the Players Association. So there are plenty of hurdles to clear before we see the actual games resume. To discuss the reopening of sports and what it could look like, we are joined by Dave Feschuk, sports columnist at The Star. Dave, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Raju.
So, Dave, let's start at the beginning. Sports was one of the first things that COVID-19 shut down. The NBA outbreak started with Rudy Gobert, and basically that shutting down was what made this serious for a lot of people. Before we talk about the specific approaches that some sports are looking at right now, what do you think about sort of the overall talk and the moves toward getting back to business as normal?
Well, having covered sports for my entire career here at the Toronto Star and going back more than 20 years, I think it's completely natural that they're talking about coming back, because if I've learned anything in my days as a sports writer, it's that these men and women who run sports are incredibly successful and incredibly fierce capitalists. And they see money evaporating from their grasp by the day, and they want to get some of it back. So as much as I also see it as foolish at times, and I see it as foolhardy, I see it as the scorpion being what the scorpion is, which is bloodthirsty and wanting to get some of its sting back.
That's a great way to start. What are you hearing about what's happening with the city's teams right now?
Well, look, the short answer is not much. I mean, we just woke up on Monday to find out that the AHL, of course, the Toronto Marlies, the top farm club of the Toronto Maple Leafs, has canceled its remaining season and its playoffs. So we don't have to worry about the Marlies anymore. They've been scratched off the list. We do know that the NBA is going to, this week in Toronto and many other places, begin allowing its players to trickle into its practice facilities. The Raptors will be having players heading into their there's a quite large practice facility out in the west end of the city, but there's going to be strict limits on who can be in there at any given time. They're going to have, I think, a maximum of 4 players in a very large gym, actually, 1 player per basket, and no head coaches allowed. Nick Nurse will not be allowed in there to observe these workouts. This is really, from what I'm being told, from what people are being told around the league, this is almost like a mental health break for the players, many of whom have not had the luxury of their own baskets. They live in a downtown condo. Of course, some of these guys are rich enough to have their own private courts, but the guys on the lower end of the pay scale who haven't been in the league very long and haven't established themselves, they don't have that luxury, and they haven't been able to shoot baskets. Of course, every public facility in every city in North America has essentially been closed, at least at some point, and certainly they're closed to this day in Toronto. So the NBA is getting back in the NHL. We're waiting for the moment when Maple Leafs might be able to get back on the ice. And I'm assuming that's going to be in the next couple of weeks.
You bring up the Leafs. There's been a lot of speculation about the NHL and this hub city plan. What are you hearing about that? And is this a serious endeavor?
Oh, it's very serious. I mean, getting back to the capitalism angle of this, the NHL stands to lose something in the range of $1 billion plus in revenue, projected revenue, I should say, because they never had it. They're losing plenty of projected revenue. What does that mean? That means that the players, even though many of them are averse to the idea of holding up in a bubble for weeks at a time, which may end up being necessary if this thing ever gets off the ground. They also understand that if that $1 billion seeps out of the projections, that comes out of their paychecks at some point. It's either going to come out of their paychecks now or later, depending on what they negotiate with the NHL. This is a league where the players probably have one of the worst collective bargaining agreements among the big four sports. The league where the players already see, 10, 15% of their paychecks go into what they call an escrow fund at the best of times. I mean, this could be a situation where players lose, when I'm talking to agents, they're talking about 35, 40% of their salaries next year, whenever next year comes, in escrow because of the fact that there's been this revenue shortfall and they're going to have to make up for it because they split revenue with the league. So again, as much as we can all sort of scoff at the idea that this is kind of crazy, there is a pent-up demand for sports content on TV, as we saw with the incredible ratings with the NFL draft getting record ratings for just, a bunch of people on Zoom talking about football players who will eventually play football. There is a huge pent-up demand, and I think the NHL, like every other league, is doing everything it can to be first in line to get something on TV as soon as possible.
That hub city plan, though, and this is one of these things that a lot of people are sort of talking about, and this is basically trying to bring the teams in and hermetically seal them basically within a hotel and an arena, right? Is that basically the gist of it?
That's the gist of it. The NBA, like most things in the pro sports that are the most prominent in Toronto, basketball and hockey. I'm not leaving the Blue Jays out. Obviously, they're talking about a very similar thing, possibly for baseball, and the Blue Jays will be part of that if indeed it happens. But the Hub City plan, I think, to put it shortly, I think Las Vegas has probably made the most compelling bid. They've got so much convention center space and so many hotel rooms available, obviously, with those casinos in that city currently shut down. There's talk they could build X number of basketball courts and convention centers, essentially TV studios, where there would be no fans, where you put the games on with the skeleton staff required for a broadcast, which is still a substantial staff to broadcast these games. And then you'd hold up the players in a bubble. I mean, the NHL would essentially do the same thing in some of their arenas. They're not talking about the bubble in these sort of TV studios. They're talking about doing it in arenas. But it's problematic on so many different levels, right? I mean, you've got a substantial number of people beyond the players on the roster. You've got incredible numbers of support staff that need to be with these teams, or certainly accustomed to being with these teams. And even if you pare it down to the bare minimum, you've got a lot of people involved. And how do you go about it? If somebody tests positive, what do you do? I mean, these are questions that nobody has an answer to right now. These are questions the league continues to ponder. But again, these are leagues that are desperate to recoup revenue, and they're willing to wait. The NHL and the NBA have said, look, we're not in a hurry here. It's mid-May. We're 2 months from the day that Rudy Gobert tested positive, and the sports world, along with the rest of the world, was put on hold and certainly put on notice that this was serious. There's talk that the NHL would be okay with waiting until the fall, waiting until August or September to resume. There's talk that the NBA would be willing to wait till July or August to resume. So, as much as we can, I think it's very valid to criticize these ideas right now. As we also know, a lot can change in a day, a week, a month, in the course of this very unpredictable pandemic. And I think the leagues are hoping for the best, that things do change in their favor, and these things don't seem so outlandish a month or two down the road.
You're a columnist, and I think that this is one of the most interesting questions about this, in that it seems like anything is on the table right now with the way that these sports returned. I mean, baseball is one of those things that tradition always matters, and yet we're talking about potentially a 3 realigned divisions to make it work. There's been some NBA speculation that you could let in a lot more teams and have some sort of elimination style tournament. What do you think about some of these ideas to sort of, when they come back, making things, I guess, a bit more interesting?
There are no sacred cows in sports. There never have been. Baseball is probably the one that holds them dearest, but they've been willing to change slowly over time. Nothing would surprise me. Obviously, they're going to have to make something up along the way here and try and make it fair. There will be people who argue about whether or not it's fair, and that's part of the beauty of sports. Heck, I'll tell you what, the NHL, the NBA, the Major League Baseball commissioners would all be happy today if we were arguing about whether or not their proposed format, which they are going to undertake in the next few days, was fair or not, because it would mean they were back in business, and it would mean people were re-engaged in talking about sports instead of talking about a virus. So that's the dream goal, is to be talking about whether or not the plan is fair for the teams that are competing. Because right now it's just hard to imagine teams actually worried about competing, worried about wins and losses, when they're really right now concerned about the very existence of their sports.
We've talked a lot about money, and let's talk about fans. You wrote a great column last week about Raptors and Leafs season ticket holders getting upset at MLSC. What was that about?
It's funny, it's about money. Even though it's about fans, it's about the ruthless capitalists on 40 Bay Street who run the Maple Leafs and Raptors and TFC and pretty much every other team in this city outside of the Blue Jays. It was about them asking the season ticket holders for the Toronto Raptors and the Toronto Maple Leafs to start paying for their tickets, not for this season, but for next season, the 2021 season, of course, the beginning, the end, the existence of which we have no idea about right now. And let's just say season ticket holders for both those teams, even though the ones who pay for Leaf tickets are sort of notoriously known around town and many other places as the ultimate in suckers, because they've been paying premium prices for a less than premium product for decades, often a less than premium product. Lately, it's been more on the premium side. Even those suckers took umbrage with the idea that they were supposed to be paying for something that may or may not happen in a month we may or may not know down the road. So, and there was real pushback there. And MLSE, to its credit, listened. There was supposed to be a payment due of 23% of the entire freight for next season for Raptors and Leafs tickets, which is a big number. I mean, even the less expensive Leaf tickets in the upper bowl, you're looking at, $14,000, they vary, but $12,000, $14,000, $15,000 for a pair for the season. They wanted 23% of that on April 8th. There was pushback. They moved that date to May 8th. There was more pushback around May 8th, and now they've moved that date to June 8th. And I'm sensing there's going to be pushback about paying 23% on June 8th because, again, we don't even know about when this season, this interrupted season, is going to end. And people are really taking umbrage with the principle of why would we start paying for next year when we don't even know what's happening with this year? And I think they obviously have a very good point. And I think that even the team that has been able to get away with charging these prices and getting people to pay up front for many, many years, even the team has to acknowledge they have a point.
That's a perfect way to get into another interesting ticket idea. The Miami Dolphins CEO went on Good Morning America and showed some of their plans for an NFL stadium with social distancing. So basically, one of the ideas was limiting seating to about 15,000 people in a stadium that holds 65,000. Can you see a way for that to work?
I think I can. Yeah, I can. Right now it's difficult because of what's going on, but if things change down the road, the NFL season isn't supposed to begin until September, so they've got some runway there, even though I think they're realizing that the runway is getting awfully short. But if you read some of the studies about the transmission outdoors and how it's less likely outdoors, I mean, depending on which studies you believe and which studies are credible to your eye, there is some idea that it is different with an outdoor sport. And if you can say, if you're a quarter full, so in other words, you got one seat occupied and every seat around that person, one in front, one to the side, one behind, is not occupied, or how much space do you need? I don't know the answer to that, but I could see an answer being formulated. I could see there being some science around that. But it is far-fetched, and it is also something you have to believe that these businesses are run on those stadiums being generally full, although the Miami Dolphins are not necessarily one of those teams that has the luxury of chronic sellouts, but the majority of NFL teams that are doing well do sell out on any given day. And so the idea that they're going to be running their business with, quarter-filled stadiums, obviously it's going to be less attractive. It's funny how different owners see it different ways. You've seen, as much as the Raptors are getting back to practice this week, they're expected to, as early as today, have 4 players in their gym at a time shooting baskets. It's not really practice. It's not team activities, but it is individual workouts. Mark Cuban, the guy who runs the Dallas Mavericks in the NBA, who may or may not want to make a presidential run down the road, obviously a pretty famous American with some show business acumen who has definitely been a big critic of Donald Trump. Cuban has said he's not allowing his players into the gym, even though the NBA is allowing it. And even though Texas has, I think some of the lower caseloads in the States. He's not allowing his players into the gym until they all can be tested, is what he's said, until all his employees can be tested. And he's not willing to take those tests away from the greater market until there's more tests available.
That's what this is all about. Who do we trust with our lives? Seriously, if you're a player, who do you trust with your life? If you're a coach or a trainer, anybody for that matter, that's essential personnel and getting something back together, do you trust the hotel that we're going to stay at to keep everything safe? Who do you trust with your life? That's a big question to ask somebody.
So every owner sees it differently. There's definitely owners who will be much more skittish about these types of plans, and there's owners who are incredibly bullish, saying unless there's a law against us having these games, we're having these games.
It's a great jumping off point to my next question, and it's about politics. This is one of these things where this is totally a game of political football happening with politicians. Donald Trump wants leagues to come back and is pushing them. Doug Ford has warned about no sports.
I don't even know when they plan on starting the season, but they're going to be playing in empty stadiums. And I think everyone wants to see a little bit of sports if they're doing it responsibly. But those rules will apply for all those teams. There isn't going to be an exception.
The governor of California said probably sports not coming back until there's a vaccine. This is a big question. I mean, you're a sports guy, not right about politics, but it is one of these things that's also going to be a factor with every jurisdiction in terms of how these sports leagues can get up and running again. And then that also impacts fairness, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, for sure. It does impact fairness. I mean, the NFL actually talked about competitive equity and how it's not going to allow its teams to resume business and sort of open up their facilities, open up their offices until the bulk of the teams, if not all the teams, are allowed to do that in their jurisdiction. The NHL has talked about the balance of equity. They're talking about a critical number of markets allowing their teams to get back on the ice for practice before we allow it. And they're not there yet, even though Ontario has essentially opened up for business. The Maple Leafs, the Ottawa Senators could do so. It does come down to fairness. It does come down to politics. I mean, I'm a big golfer, and, you know, I think it's 48 out of 50 states right now are allowing golf. I'm not asking for sympathy. I know golfing is probably not a politically correct thing to be talking about in terms of the need for golf. There is no need for golf. There's a hankering. There's a desire for golf. I certainly have it. I would argue it's probably the most safe sport I can think of. I like to play many sports. I like to play pickup basketball. I wouldn't do that. I like to play pickup hockey. I wouldn't do that. I like to play golf. I would do that because A, I'm usually in the woods, far off, looking for my golf ball all by my lonesome, and it's very socially distant to the type of golf I play. And B, there are, practical ways you can avoid any sort of contact with any surface that another human being will have touched by playing with the flag in and not using the rakes and the bunkers that are generally a commonly touched thing. Not having clubhouses open, not having food and beverage served inside, maybe having a takeout service, just like every other takeout service in town. So I would argue, but Doug Ford has dragged his feet on opening up golf courses.
I have a lot of friends that are golfers, and they're lobbying hard for this golf. We have to just listen to the chief medical officer.
Probably for the political reason of, nobody wants to hear that the golfers are having a good time because it's seen as an elitist sport, even though I would argue it isn't necessarily an elitist sport, even though there are elites that play it. This is a very political situation as much as it's a situation about the health of the greater population. It doesn't surprise me that there's great variance across the board with how people view it, and certainly we all have to put up with the idea that, hey, we may not agree, but I understand why they're not opening golf courses, even if I don't agree with it.
What do you think is the best way forward? And when do you think, ballpark it, these things are coming back?
I wish I had that crystal ball. I mean, the best way forward is the safe way forward. The best way forward is the cautious way forward. I mean, I understand the money at stake in these leagues, but these leagues are also awash with money in general. And I do think because of the pent-up demand that is being created by this situation, they'll be able to recoup some of this money in the rush and whenever we get back, whenever things return to normal, if they indeed do. Look, I'm crossing my fingers like everybody else that they get back to something close to normal. In the long run, I'm not crying for major league sports owners. In the long run, I'm not worried about the Leafs and the Raptors. Who would be? These are leagues run by billionaires in sports played by multimillionaires. They'll be okay, as will the rest of us who love watching these games. I don't know how it's going to all go down. I do know they're going to keep trying. I do know that the capitalistic urge to get back into the black and quit being in the red is going to be the driving force here. And it's going to have to be tempered by the wisdom of people who see something beyond that greed. And whether or not it will be, certainly if you're looking at the United States and the leadership at hand there, I'm not sure it will be down there. And I think that could be calamitous. Up here, that's another problematic thing. Do we want to open our borders to American athletes or Americans in general, given the situation in the States? That's a question, we're going to continue to ask in the weeks and months ahead.
It's another one for the politicians. I'm glad I don't have to deal with it. Dave, this has been amazing for us. I'm just curious, how are you doing without sports? Are you enjoying this break? Are you watching South Korean baseball? What?
I haven't really delved into the KBO and the Korean baseball scene. I've certainly watched my share of it. I've watched more than probably most people, but I wouldn't call myself a knowledgeable observer of Korean baseball at this point. I do have a certain affinity for Korea because I spent a bit of time there at the Olympics a couple of years ago and had a lot of fun. So I'm always interested in what the Koreans are up to. But no, this has not been good for me. I'll tell you that right now. It's been not good for any sports writer. I've been on the phone with a lot of sports executives. It's kind of like torture for a lot of us. Now, I certainly realize that, I'm well aware of the fact the anniversary of VE Day, that we're not going through real hardship here. This is fake hardship. But certainly, for those of us who have a passion, not only to watch, but to play sports, yeah, it has been a little bit tough. It's certainly inconvenient at the very least. And there's certainly a hankering to get back, certainly a hankering to get a haircut like a lot of us. And I'm not going to be like some of the NBA players I've seen getting haircuts with barbers in hazmat suits. I won't be doing that. But yeah, I mean, this has been difficult for everybody that cares about sports. It's not life and death. We realize that it's a game. But it's a game that enhances lives, right? It's a game that, for a lot of people, is a great mental health outlet. It's a great way to keep fit. It's a great way to socialize. And when all those things are taken away, I've got friends who live alone that their only social contact is their volleyball league or their road hockey league or their slow pitch league. And they don't have that now. It's like a lot of people who are really yearning for social contact beyond phone calls or Zoom meetings. I think people are going to appreciate their sports more than ever when indeed we're able to reconvene in those venues.
I can't wait till they come back. That was great for us. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Dave Feschuk is a sports columnist at the Toronto Star. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Raju Mudhar, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etisaz. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Foso. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.